So Alan and I actually go back, gosh, 5 years maybe?
A bit more, yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah, probably more like 6.
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, we met back in, gosh, 2014 when the Harwell Space Cluster was just burgeoning, and the ESA building was a twinkle in our eyes.
Yeah. Yeah, and bizarrely, I came over from Australia to work for the European Space Agency in the UK to help set up a centre here.
And that's ironic because I came from the United States to the UK to help grow the UK Space Cluster.
Yeah. So it was an international cluster right from the beginning. Yeah.
They brought us foreigners in, huh?
Yeah.
But yes, we've had a good run. Well, welcome to everybody who's joining us. We've got quite a few people that have joined. Thank you, everybody. Nick and Sam and Tracy. Thank you also to all of our viewers on YouTube. Again, my name is Stephen Ringler. I'm the CEO and founder of Space Store, and just a warm welcome to everybody joining us tonight. Apologies if we're expecting Lakshay, who's our normal Thursday night host, is taking a week off, which is so well deserved, and I'm sitting in for him. So yes, welcome. We're really excited tonight. We're actually trying a slightly different format where we're doing a bit more of a Q&A, an interview. And tonight our guest is none other than Alan Brunstrom. Welcome, Alan, to the show.
Thanks very much. Nice to be here.
Great. Just a little bit about Alan. He comes from a space background. He's worked in the space industry for 35 years. He helped spearhead the setup of ESA's center here in the UK. It's the Center for Space Applications and Telecommunications, EXAT, over probably the course of, what, 7 years, 8 years, 9 years? 10 years. And he is a novelist, an author, and he writes a number of nonfiction articles. And so really great to have you, Alan.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for coming. So today, we're going to be talking about the what-ifs around Mars. And, tell us a little bit about what we're going to be talking about.
Yes, I mean, there's a lot of what ifs about Mars, but the one that interests me most is the so what if there is life on Mars? And within the space sector, obviously, there's a tremendous amount of excitement about Mars. There's many missions that are being geared up to go this month, this year as well. But as a novelist, I have a rather different take on it. And by chance, just before the coronavirus epidemic broke out, I'd started writing a sci-fi book, which was a new departure for me. I'm not normally a sci-fi author. And it was about an alien virus that hitchhiked on the Mars sample return mission, which is due to go in the next few years, and then creates a pandemic back on Earth. So I'm not terribly sure whether this is art following fiction or fiction following art, but that's what set me down the path of this topic.
Well, very interesting that you're writing now about science fiction when you've actually worked very much in the space industry and what's real. So have you worked on anything in Mars, like since you worked for ESA for so long? Have you worked on any Mars missions?
Well, I was never involved in the Mars missions directly, but my role in the last few years has been mostly space communications. So it's been external relations and communications, telling people about space and about what space can do for them. And that involves a lot of public and outward-facing work. And of course, in the course of that, you get a lot of questions. I'm often sitting in an exhibition stand next to a Mars rover, for instance.
Yeah.
So you end up as a communications expert fielding an awful lot of questions from the general public about every subject, and Mars is one of the biggies.
Brilliant. So you know a lot about Mars, a lot to share about. And we talked a little bit before we broadcasted about kind of where our relationship started about 6 years ago. So I'm putting up a picture for everybody to see of Harwell campus. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about Harwell and what you've done there and what's going on there.
Sure, yeah. So Harwell became the primary centre of the UK space industry really by government decision a decade or so ago. And at the time, there was no European Space Agency physical presence in the UK, although he's sort of always been one of the founding fathers of European Space Agency. And we decided we would build a centre in Harwell. It was a little bit of a quid pro quo with the UK government massively increasing its investment in space, which of course has continued through successive governments to the present. And I don't think any of us knew at the time whether this would succeed or not. There wasn't a lot of space presence at Harwell previously, and in fact it's been a remarkable success. And we've gone from 2 or 3 companies in space sector in the Harwell campus to, well, it's past 100 now, past 1,000 people. It's really taken off, and obviously the Easter Centre was part of that, but there was also satellite applications, Catapult, and many other organisations.
That's amazing. And so at Harwell campus is the topic of Mars, since you've filled a lot of questions about Mars in your career. Is that something that work that goes on there? Is that something that's going to be going on? What can you tell us about that?
There is some robotic exploration activity centred at Harwell. It's not the main activity. The main activity is to do with satellite communications and down-to-earth applications, which is more my field. But yeah, there's a small but quite key team working on things that relate to rovers.
Brilliant. Well, let's start getting into some of the nitty-gritty interesting questions then that you've probably been asked a lot, but to get your take. So is there life on Mars? That's a question that must have come up a lot.
Yeah, and of course the straight answer is we don't know, and that's why the main driver for going there. Actually, it's the principal point of interest. By no means the only reason for going, but you get a lot of, I think, rather nonsensical stats put out there, which run along the lines of, well, okay, the Earth is the only planet where we know there's life, but we now know there are many other planets that have the right kind of chemistry and atmosphere, and the right kind of sweet spot relative to the right kind of sun where maybe life could occur. And if there are billions of those and you take a very small percentage, then you end up believing that there are millions of aliens out there. And this is nonsensical because, of course, we have no data points other than the Earth. We don't know whether the probability of life occurring elsewhere is 1 in 10 or 1 in a billion or 0. Yeah. We just don't know. If we go to Mars and we find evidence of life, either extant or in the past, that really changes that entire equation. All of a sudden, life is not unique on the Earth, and therefore those kind of statistics come in, and it becomes then very, very likely that in fact there will be many other forms of life in the universe.
So why do you say nonsensical? I think that's really interesting, because isn't, if our main objective is to go to Mars, is to discover, is there life on Mars? And that's what so many people are behind. Why call it nonsensical?
The nonsensical bit is simply working out a statistical equation of how many other civilizations or aliens might be out there, when we don't have at the moment any other data point than what's right here on Earth.
This is true. Well, I'm now showing everybody an image of Curiosity, a rover that's loves to take selfies of itself. So tell us a little bit about what have we been discovering on Mars? What's been, what do we know?
Sure. So, I mean, we've been on Mars in a sense for quite a few years. There have been a number of landers, a number of rovers. Curiosity is doing incredibly well, still trundling around after all these years. And there have been many failed attempts as well. But I guess the robotic presence and the surveillance presence on Mars is greater than most people know. What we've been discovering recently, and what's going to be followed up with a whole slew of missions that are going out actually this coming year, is that we have much more evidence now that leads us to believe that it's perfectly feasible for there to have been life on Mars. We now know much more about the chemistry, we know much more about the atmosphere, we know it had an atmosphere that was stripped away by the solar winds, we know that there was flowing water, We know that there's still frozen water on the poles and probably subsurface. We have trace gases like methane coming out. So we have a lot of reasons to believe that it's realistic and feasible that there might have been life. And we have a fairly good idea about where to go to look for it, because we want certain things, and water is one of the key ones.
So I've kind of picked up in your tone and from the topic that, and you mentioned earlier this idea, well, so what? So what if we find it? Why do you say so what? I take it you're a little bit of a skeptic about the importance of this, and because we have all these missions going. You mentioned the Chinese. There's a new UAE mission going. This year, NASA launching another one. So what?
Yeah. I think there's a big difference between what is scientifically interesting and what is interesting to the majority of people you might meet in the street, who might have a casual interest in it, but who would probably ask the question, well, so what does it mean for me? What difference does it make to me? To which the answer is very often pretty much zero. And in this respect, I'm unusual within the space industry, because I spent most of my adult life in the space industry. I was 12 when Armstrong landed on the moon. I'm of that generation, and I've been surrounded all my career with people who would preface their comments with, when I saw Neil Armstrong first step onto the moon, that was the moment of inspiration that persuaded me that I was going to go into this industry. And I've never shared that enthusiasm. I've never shared that view that reaching the moon was such an incredible achievement. I always took the view, from the age of 12 onwards, that it was the first global overhyped media event, and that it was actually a diversion away from what's really important. And we should come back to that, about what the purpose of space exploration is and why it helps, what's good about it and bad about it. And I think with Mars, there is a certain element of the same thing, that it's the next logical place. We're going back to the moon in a big way, and we're going on to Mars. Why? What is it that we seek to achieve? Now, yes, we'll find out, was there life? Is there life? But it does come back to the so what. And to me, the key issue is, look, there are really three things that we might find. We might find that there was life, but it's extinct. It's quite likely. We might find that there still is life, probably microbial life under the surface, where it's safe from radiation and where there's water. And we might be able to bring that back. Or we might find that there's actually intelligent life, but if it exists, it's probably so advanced that we can't even understand it or recognize it. Those are probably the three classes of response. And to me, only the third, only the discovery of an intelligence or a species more advanced than ourselves, actually makes any profound difference to humanity. The fact that there's some bugs on Mars and they might be dead or they might be alive, is it going to change the life of the man in the street? Not really.
Interesting. I think I'm about to get picked on a little bit here and made fun of, because you've said a couple of things that I say, that I was inspired to work in the space industry because of my grandfather working on the Apollo missions. I am desperately eager to find out if there is life on Mars, to kind of prove this idea that there is life teeming in the universe. But it sounds like there's, maybe if we do discover one of the first two options that you described, so what? So I would personally get very excited, but I guess you're saying that people, maybe not everybody's like me, or not like some of these.
Yeah, I think one of the problems in the space industry is that it's full of people who are very, very, very enthusiastic about space. And outside of the space industry, there's a small coterie of nerds, if you like, people who are also very enthusiastic. They tend to lose sight of the fact that their enthusiasm is not that widely shared. And my view of the Apollo missions was that for every person who was massively inspired by that achievement, there was somebody else like me who was lukewarm, and a third person who thought it was a colossal waste of money. And in some sense, I mean, and that wasn't a stupid attitude, because what was it driven by? It was driven by the Cold War, by national hubris, and by the natural inclination of scientists and engineers to want to push the boundaries and achieve the most they can. But what difference did it make for a majority of mankind? Now, the thing that's interesting is that the development of rocketry, the development of space exploration, came out of war, was developed for purposes of war and national advancement, and is being pursued now out of a mixture of those things and greed and ego. But its enormous value, its tremendous justification, is that it's enabled us to put satellites into orbit, to look backwards onto the Earth, and to manage and protect this planet and our environment in ways that are becoming absolutely critical for our survival. And I think the difficulty with the space exploration, the sort of excitement about Mars, is that although it's, I'm not trying to knock it, I'm not trying to disparage it really. In a sense, it's looking the wrong way. It's helping to achieve things technically which are tremendously valuable, but they're much more valuable back here on Earth than they are in terms of what we're going to be doing on Mars or anywhere else in any of our lifetimes.
That's interesting. So I think, that makes me question our messaging. So how do we, if that's the case, if there's all this value, intrinsic value in going out and exploring this, it should be it's being honed back here on Earth, how to protect our planet. What are we doing with our messaging? Because that's not necessarily what you hear on the news. You hear, oh, are we alone? Are we the only ones out there? Is it?
It's getting better. I mean, there's images behind us here in the space store, which are good examples of the Earth observation images that are transforming our understanding of our own world. And you can see fantastic programs on TV now, like Earth from Space. And these are not just visually wonderful, they're enormously practically valuable. And that sort of technology is improving. And some of the technologies we're developing in order to be able to go and do things like colonize Mars are also very helpful. So I think the balance has changed, and it's becoming something that more people can understand. But I think it's still the nature of the industry to be an industry of enthusiasts who focus on the thing that drives them and forget too often that that isn't necessarily the thing that matters to the rest of the population. So, as a communications person, that's a constant.
A constant thing. Yeah. So interesting. Well, we've had the image of Neil Armstrong walking on the moon up in the back, which in the background, very much indicating, as you said, that really the whole race to the moon was based on war. It was based on exerting one's power, nation's power. But we've now turned that over the course of the last 50 years to it's helping things on Earth. So maybe one of the questions, so we've got actually a lot of questions that have come in from the audience. I'll be asking in some of these shortly, but maybe before we get into that, what happens then if we discover life on Mars? What do you think is the what happens? What happens to us as a...
Okay, so a whole series of interesting things happen, and these are obviously enormous scientific excitement. I mean, that would be the greatest scientific discovery of the age, perhaps of any age, within the scientific community. That's a given. And who knows what we'll learn from that. It raises some profound ethical issues. I mean, we're developing a Mars sample return mission. It keeps getting delayed for budgetary reasons, but let's say that sometime in the 2030s, there will be a mission which will go to Mars, pick up samples that have been deposited there by rovers like Perseverance and others beforehand, which have had some analysis made of them and been back, but it will pick up physical samples, it will blast off, bring them back to Earth. There will be a bio-contained sample facility. It might be built at Harvard campus. One of them might be there, for instance. Certainly very likely that one will be in the UK. And we know, or we think we know, how to handle samples so that we don't contaminate them and they don't contaminate us. So the biocontainment side of it, we think we understand. My novel is all about, but what if you don't?
Okay.
But okay, let's assume that we do understand that. It does, however, raise some basic ethical questions about, do we have the right to go to another world and start messing with its biosystems, its ecosphere, its forms of life? Those will be brushed aside by most of those involved in the determination to pursue this and to pursue knowledge and to explore. Lip service will be given to those, but it'll essentially be brushed aside. The religious or philosophical impact, you might think will be very great. There's life on another planet. But actually, I don't think it will be. There'll be a little kerfuffle of interest. But the way that we view other species is that we think of ourselves as being at the top. We are the top of the pyramid. We are the top species. In a sense, we have replaced God in our own world because he's kind of absent. So we're at the top, and most people on Earth have tended historically to think that everything else exists to serve them. Some people think that religiously, that everything else was created for the benefit of mankind, to use or abuse as we see fit. Others simply think we do it because we can. If you discover a low level of life, or what we consider a low level of life, microbe, bacteria, amoeba, on Mars, that position doesn't really change. It's just, okay, they happen to be on Mars rather than in Zambia. But the philosophical and religious position doesn't change. And I think political, philosophical, and religious leaders will quickly adapt to this without any fundamental change in their position. It's only if you encounter a highly advanced intelligence that all of that changes and all of that is challenged. Now, sadly, I don't think we're going to. I think it's extremely implausible that we will find that on Mars, and if it existed, we probably wouldn't recognize it.
You're crushing childhood dreams here. So so let's unpack that a little bit more. So I've just put up the image of kind of the little green man that everybody thinks about when they think about extraterrestrials, and so if we do discover that, what's the change? What's the shift? What happens then?
Well, if you look at what we've done historically to every other intelligent species, most of which have been other forms of human, we've exterminated them. As far as we can tell from the record, only Homo sapiens comes out. We tended to subjugate, dominate, domesticate, or destroy anything else remotely resembling an intelligent species. Doesn't bode terribly well for future encounters. I like to think we're learning as a species, becoming more civilized, but our record isn't terribly good. And if we were to encounter another species that was more powerful, I think that's really ultimately, maybe more intelligent, certainly more advanced than us, it will give us the most profound problems because we would be filled with fear. We would be filled with aggression, which is the normal human response to fear and insecurity. So I think we'd have a terrible presumption of how this was going to go, which wouldn't be a good starting point. But more fundamentally than that, it would change our entire view of our position in the universe. We would no longer be at the top. And that would mean we would no longer even be that important. We'd just be one species among many. And maybe those other species are going to intervene. So, that would be a change in human thinking, more profound than has ever occurred in our history.
So given that kind of epic change that it would make in the way we think and the way we do things, are we doing enough to prepare for what might happen in these scenarios? I mean, I think I look back at history, and you think of, we don't seem to make changes unless something drastic happens, unless something COVID is a perfect example, right? Like we were, as a globe, not well prepared for this pandemic. are we prepared for this kind of change that would come if we discovered that there was more powerful life?
No, I mean, and humanity never has been. I mean, if you look back at the old explorers who went out and found what for them were new worlds, no one was prepared for the Spanish weren't prepared for the discovery of the new world. They weren't prepared for the discovery of vast deposits of gold and silver, and it totally changed their economy and their way of life. We weren't prepared for the pandemics that occurred in both directions as we discovered new continents, and we had almost no control over our own reactions as societies to the places we and the peoples that we encountered. Think about what happened in North America or what happened in Australia. So I mean, humanity doesn't work that way. We are not to speak. I mean, although we have the mental capacity in theory to plan and think about these things and prepare, actually we tend to be very ad hoc. We tend to respond to things when they're right in our face and unavoidable.
Seat of our pants kind of like response. So
yeah, but fortunately, as I say, I don't think we're likely to have this problem anytime soon. Personally, I'm not a Star Trekker. I'm not a believer in the feasibility of travel beyond the speed of light, and therefore I don't believe that with short of thousands of years that we are at all likely to encounter advanced alien species, even though I believe they probably exist somewhere. And that's why in the book that I'm writing, provisionally called After the Event being an alien pandemic, what's actually happened is that an advanced species somewhere far across the universe has sent a virus, rather like in a scattergun approach, which is capable of transmitting its own, if you like, its own thoughts, its own consciousness. And that hitchhikes on bacteria, which we bring back from Mars, and infects us before we even realize what's happening. And what it produces is an enlightenment. It produces exactly what I'd really like to see humanity do, which is move up a notch in the evolutionary chain. And what the book's really about is how society responds. This is another way of answering your question. How would society respond to an outbreak of improved sanity, of improved intelligence, of greater enlightenment? To which my answer is civil war and great resistance. But in the end, it would prevail just as cognitive revolutions have prevailed over great resistance several times in our past.
So I find it so interesting that you have spent your career in nonfiction and working in the space industry and what's real. We talked about these Earth observation imageries, and you're now writing a book that's in science fiction. And you said, "Oh, I'm not a Star Trek person," So what's kind of gotten to you to why this vehicle?
I think in part it was accident. It was having conversations about the exploration of Mars, and I suspect it's quite likely that we will find either life or evidence that there has been life.
Yeah,
I'm not going to put a percentage on it. I don't believe in that, but I think if we discover that there was, I won't be surprised. Yeah. It's nature might surprise me, but I wouldn't be surprised by the thing itself. So it was having those sorts of discussions as a communications person. Yeah. Set me thinking about, okay, what are the implications? And at the same time, like I'm sure everybody else listening in, I look around at what's going on in the world, in our country, in your country, with increasing amazement, of the rather bewildered and horrified type, thinking, what would it take to improve this species, to make us more fit guardians of the planet? And really, shaking my head, thinking, I don't see it. I don't see how we're going to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps here. And it was the juxtaposition of those two ideas made me think, well, actually, this is a very Star Trek idea. We need a helping hand.
And we need to write about it. There you go. Well, okay, we've got quite a few questions here from the audience. Before I jump into those, my last question for you then is, so you just used the word Guardians, it made me think of Guardians of the Galaxy, good movie. So Guardians of the Earth, so what should we, given your experience in the space industry, what should we be thinking about? What should humanity be thinking about how we can guard the planet that we live on? What are some of the things that you would encourage us to think more about?
Unfortunately, everybody knows the answer. You know, it's been stuck in our face by Greta and many others over these last few years. I mean, we know what we're doing to the planet, and all the Earth observation imagery and data has merely confirmed what we previously only thought. So we know we're destroying the environment. We know we're pushing ourselves towards a cliff. Because we don't like, as a species, to face things until they become absolutely critical, we have a sort of deep entrenched tendency to shy away from the obvious until we just can't shy away from it, until we're right on the edge of the cliff. And that's a problem which all of us actually have the ability to do our bit to overcome. Well, we're not doing great. There's only a few countries on the planet that are seriously taking this matter in hand. And by this matter, I don't really mean climate change. I don't just mean that we're going to probably have spiraling increases in heat producing extreme weather events, the like of which most people can't conceive. It's not just that, it's much more than that. It's the overall impact we're having on the planet, which is clearly unsustainable. And space gives us many of the tools we need to monitor that and inform ourselves. That's not the problem. The problem is our decision-making process as societies.
Interesting. Well, I, for one, am very much looking forward to the new book. After we go through some of the audience questions, we'll talk a little bit about your current book too. But thank you, everybody, for your questions. So one question that we have is, so what do you think if there's irrefutable evidence is returned from one of the ESA or NASA or Chinese missions in the coming years, that funding for missions to Europe or Enceladus would be increased, or would focus be thrown solely on human spaceflight going to the Martian surface?
Okay, I think that if we discovered any credible evidence of life on Mars, present or past, it would produce a huge impetus for increased activity to Mars, and that would be actually as much robotic as human. I mean, the smart way to do it is actually largely robotic. We will send humans to Mars because humans want to go to Mars, not because we need to go to Mars in order to pursue those sort of scientific investigations. I think it would produce a massive increase in funding. So I think on a very short-term, concrete fashion, money would become more readily available for a lot of space activities, not only sending humans to Mars. I think the knock-on effects would be very beneficial. It would give us an even greater need to get our Communications Act together to explain to people why that is a wise use of money. Something which we have still not really mastered in this industry.
Well, selfishly speaking, I think that if we could get more money pointed toward the space industry because of these kind of discoveries, that'd probably be a good thing. And
yes,
maybe back to your earlier point,
I agree with that for sure.
Maybe to your earlier point, then it would help push the boundaries, push the knowledge that we have to help continue to protect and be guardians of planet Earth. So another question here. So as a follow-on, so if methane is determined to be biological in origin, would scientists around the world accept that as a smoking gun, or would they only a microbe under an SME kill all that?
Okay, so technically I'm not really competent to answer the question, but I believe that there are alternative explanations for why there is trace methane coming out of Mars, which doesn't necessarily mean that there's some kind of biological activity, or that there has been some kind of biological activity. Now, I don't know enough about the topic to go beyond my understanding is that it's not quite a smoking gun. It's a very interesting clue, but it's not quite a smoking gun. And doesn't mean to say that you've necessarily got to find something alive. I mean, you know, we've had a sample coming back a few years ago, which some people thought showed microbial life probably not now. It's
Yeah.
thought, still some contention about it. So it needs to be a bit more than that. It needs to be something really irrefutable.
Okay, very cool. So here's a question about your book. Actually, if your premise of your book were to come to fruition, do you think humankind's reaction would be to go back and try to eradicate it in light of future human exploration? And would we have the right, if such an organism was too complex, to immunize against it?
I think humanity would split right down the middle in its response, between those who welcomed it with various degrees of caution or enthusiasm, and those who are massively entrenched and very, very hostile. And I think you can just look around us to see that split today in many fields. So it would really come down to who's in charge. And in my perception, unfortunately, the more authoritarian the regime, the more aggressive and repressive or destructive the response would be. So I think the answer would actually depend on which countries and which governments happen to be in the position of power at the time.
Okay, interesting. All right, we've got time for one or two more questions. So we've got a question here. If there is intelligent life on any planet, which one do you think it would be? In our solar system. I'm assuming this is referring to our solar system, but maybe they're referring to some of the exoplanets that we've recently discovered.
I don't believe we'll find intelligent life anywhere remotely near us in terms of light years. So I would be astonished, delighted but astonished, if a form of life that we would recognize as intelligent were to be found anywhere that we could reach at sunlight speed in decades, centuries. I would push it way further out. If it was closer than that, we would probably already know.
Okay. Very interesting. All right, so last question that we've got time for today. So do the space agencies of the world feel they should be fighting against the aims of Musk to colonize Mars, or go ahead and let exploration run its course?
That's a good question. I think generally the space agencies are cooperative and mutually supportive and enthusiastic. And although some, of course, are coming from nationally funded and very nationalistic programs, most are actually highly collaborative. We work with the Russians, we work with the Americans, we work with the Indians. And the privatization of space exploration has been going on for a long time and is not actually as deep as you might imagine, because Musk and Bezos and others, a huge proportion of their funds actually are public funds. They're getting funding from government. And so although there's a private entrepreneurial spirit there, they are not truly private entrepreneurs in a pure sense. It's a public-private mix, with the majority still being governmental. And I think most people in the industries feel good on it. Anybody who can drive brilliant new technology, more efficient ways of doing things, less wasteful ways of doing things that you can do in larger volumes, get more up there more quickly, wonderful.
Yeah.
So I don't see this as a conflict yet. I think when you get to the stage where we are actively exploiting alien worlds, whether it's comets on Mars or the Moon or whatever else, then I think you will see some very serious issues arising over, in particular, legalities of ownership and exploitation rights. And okay, humanity solved that historically in Antarctica, for example. I hope we will solve it again, but I think it's at that point. It's when it comes down to ownership and wealth.
Yeah.
When you get the conflict.
Interesting. Well, we've got the future to see, and what's going to turn out. There's all these things are happening, so maybe in the next couple of decades we'll start to see how that plays out. So Thank you so much, Alan, for your time today. I think before we go, just if you could tell everybody a little bit about your current book and where they can.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, I wrote a book set in Finland back in the 1980s called Searching for Satu, which we republished actually just a year or so ago. And purely, well, I suppose now you'd have to say historical fiction. But yeah, I like writing that evokes time and place, and it was a very different, unusual kind of culture and environment in Finland in the 80s. So if you're interested in a kind of mystery romance set in Cold War Finland, then look up Alan Brunstrom Searching for Satu. You can easily get it on Amazon.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thanks a lot, Alan. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today on YouTube, on Zoom. Thank you for all your questions. We look forward to seeing you again next week when Lakshay's back hosting again our Thursday night talks. Please tune in to all the different programs we have here on Space Store Live. Every other Tuesday, we have an amazing roundup that we bring to you from Nick Howes and Terry. So please join us for that. We also have various space quizzes that are coming down the pipe. So be looking at that on our social media, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, your social media of choice. Again, my name's Stephen Ringler. I'm the CEO of Space Store, and it's been so nice to have you here tonight. Thank you for joining, and we'll see you next week. Take care.
Cheers.